It was a typical afternoon at the mall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a steady stream of shoppers wandered from store to store. Amid the usual hum of conversation and the click of shoes on tile floors, one person's presence stood out. Ethan, a young man in his early 20s, entered the mall dressed casually in a black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. His heart raced as he scanned the mall's interior. He was here to buy a gift for his sister's birthday, something small yet thoughtful. The air felt unusually tense as he made his way through the crowd, dodging shoppers. His thoughts were on the task at hand, but there was something strange about the way a security guard, a tall man in his 30s with a neatly pressed uniform, kept his eyes trained on him. The guard's gaze was unwavering, as if he had been watching Ethan for a while. Ethan felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Was it his imagination, or was the guard following him? He tried to shake the feeling off. Just focus on the gift, he muttered to himself, but it didn't help. The guard was still there, a silent observer in the background. Ethan's heart raced as he sat down, trying to calm himself. He looked around, pretending to enjoy his meal, but the unease that had been building inside him wouldn't go away. Every now and then he'd glance up to see if the security guard was still there. And sure enough, the guard was standing at the entrance, his eyes locked on Ethan's position. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, but Ethan wasn't sure who was playing who. Had he done something wrong? Why was the guard so intent on following him? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even as the rest of the world continued to go on without noticing. Ethan's nerves were starting to get the better of him. He couldn't sit still any longer. Standing up abruptly, he walked towards the exit of the food court, trying to avoid the gaze of the security guard. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get out of the mall, and away from whatever this was. Just as he reached the doors, he heard a voice. "Hey, you there?" Ethan froze. He didn't turn around, but the command in the voice was unmistakable. Ethan turned just as the guard called out to him. "I need you to come with me." The words hit like a blow. Panic surged through Ethan's body as he tried to understand what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? His mind raced as the security guard stepped closer, blocking his path. Ethan's eyes darted around the food court, looking for an escape, but it was too late. There was no way out. The guard was too close now, his presence too imposing. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I haven't done anything wrong," he protested, his voice shaky. But the security guard wasn't having it. Without a word, the guard grabbed Ethan by the arm, his grip firm. "I said, come with me," he repeated. Ethan's mind spun as he was led towards the security office, his eyes wide, heart pounding. Was this really happening? Had he become a suspect in something he hadn't even realized? Ethan was escorted to the back of the mall, past the food court, and through a narrow hallway that led to a small security office. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The guard's grip on his arm remained tight, almost suffocating. Ethan couldn't comprehend what was happening. He had just been minding his own business, shopping for a gift. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The security office was dimly lit, with monitors displaying various areas of the mall, their screens flickering faintly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and stale air. Ethan was shoved into a chair, the cold metal digging into his back. "Sit tight," the guard said, his voice flat. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his hands clammy. What had he done to deserve this? Was he being mistaken for someone else? The sound of a door creaking open interrupted his thoughts, and a man in a white shirt stepped inside, holding a tablet. His eyes narrowed when he saw Ethan. "You, stay there," he said sharply. The man in the white shirt, who introduced himself as Officer Reynolds, walked over to the monitors, his face grim. "We have footage of you on the cameras," he said, tapping the tablet in his hands. Ethan's heart sank. "Footage?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What do you mean footage?" He couldn't remember doing anything wrong. Officer Reynolds didn't respond right away. Instead, He swiped through the images on the screen. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, straining to see the screen. There, in the blurry footage, was a figure who looked remarkably like him. It was hard to tell for sure. It was just a shadow, a blur. "We've got you taking something from the store," Officer Reynolds said, pointing to the screen. "You've been caught in the act." The words hit like a punch to the gut. "I didn't steal anything," Ethan protested, his voice rising. "This is a mistake." The officer remained silent for a moment, studying Ethan's reaction. The guard beside him just stood there, eyes unblinking, waiting. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't make sense of it. How could the footage be so unclear? It wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the more he looked, the more it seemed like him. Was he being framed? His pulse quickened as he thought of the security guard following him earlier. Had he planted something in Ethan's bag? "That's not me," Ethan insisted, his voice almost a whisper. "You've got the wrong guy. I didn't steal anything." Officer Reynolds sighed, lowering the tablet. "You're not being accused of a minor offense. You were caught taking something of value. We're going to have to call the police if you don't cooperate." His words felt like a sentence. Ethan's heart pounded harder in his chest. He couldn't believe it. His life had just flipped upside down. Everything had been fine until the moment he stepped into this mall. Now, it seemed like there was no escape. Ethan's thoughts swirled as Officer Reynolds continued to talk about contacting the authorities. His mind refused to accept what was happening. How could he have been caught on tape? Was it possible the footage had been doctored? His desperation grew with each passing second. "I didn't do it," Ethan repeated, his voice now pleading. "I swear I didn't." Officer Reynolds remained silent for a moment, before speaking again in a measured tone. "You can deny it all you want, but the evidence speaks for itself." Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out. But before he could say anything more, the door opened again, and another man, older with gray hair, walked in. He looked around the room before fixing his gaze on Ethan. "What's going on here?" the man asked. Officer Reynolds explained the situation briefly, and the older man nodded. "I see," he said, then turned to Ethan. "You're telling me you didn't take anything?" Ethan nodded vigorously, desperate. "I didn't, please." The man interrupted him. "We'll see. Let's take another look at the footage." As the older man stepped closer, Ethan felt his stomach churn with anxiety. The man stared at the tablet screen, and then at Ethan. There was no expression on his face, just cold calculation. "This could be a misunderstanding," the older man said after a long pause. Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding, grateful for the chance to explain himself. "Please, it's all a mistake. I didn't take anything, you have to believe me." But the man didn't respond right away. He glanced at Officer Reynolds, who gave a slight nod. The older man seemed to weigh his options carefully before finally speaking. Fine, we'll review the footage again. But I'm warning you, if this is found to be true, it will be serious. You'll be banned from the premises, and legal action will follow." Ethan nodded frantically, relieved but still terrified. The waiting felt endless as the officers moved around him, discussing what to do next. He couldn't help but feel the walls closing in, his every move scrutinized. What was going to happen to him now? The hours dragged on as Ethan sat in the cold, sterile security office. Officer Reynolds and the older man had left him alone to stew in his thoughts. His mind raced, bouncing between fear and frustration. Why had they singled him out? What had happened to the simple day he had planned? His fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of his hoodie, his mind still reeling from the footage. Was it really him in that video? He thought about the security guard's strange behavior earlier. Had he been followed the entire time? Did they know something Ethan didn't? Just as his thoughts began to spiral, the door creaked open, and Officer Reynolds reappeared, followed by the older man. Ethan straightened in his chair, preparing for the worst. "We've reviewed the footage again," the older man said, his voice cold. "And you're not the person we were looking for." Ethan's stomach twisted in confusion and relief. Was it possible? What? He asked, barely able to believe the words. You're free to go, the older man added. But the confusion lingered. Then why was I brought here in the first place? Ethan's voice shook. The officer didn't answer, only motioning for him to leave. Ethan stood in the lobby of the mall, the cool air of the entrance making his breath catch in his throat. He was free, technically. But the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on him. He had been accused of something he didn't do, and the thought of being so easily labeled was overwhelming. As he walked out of the mall, the sounds of the bustling city streets felt surreal. The world outside had continued, untouched by the chaos he had just experienced. Ethan's hands were still shaking as he fumbled with his phone trying to process everything. He had no idea who to call or what to do next. It felt like everything he knew had shifted. Who could he trust now? Was this some sort of mistake, or was there more to it? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following him. But there was no one. The streets were crowded, but they felt alien to him now. He wasn't sure if he would ever feel normal again. Ethan's phone buzzed in his hand. His heart skipped a beat as he looked down at the screen. It was a text from his friend, Jake. Hey, I heard what happened. Are you okay? Ethan stared at the message for a moment, the words feeling like a lifeline. He quickly typed back, not sure. They let me go. But I still don't understand what happened. He pressed send and waited for a response, but the seconds dragged on. His mind wandered back to the mall, the security guard who had followed him, the strange accusations, and the way the officers had treated him like a criminal. His phone buzzed again. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Let's talk this through. It's not right, man. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his emotions release just a little. At least Jake believed him. The thought of having someone to talk to, someone who understood, gave him a small sense of relief. He just wasn't sure how to explain all of this to anyone else. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat on a bench outside a nearby coffee shop, waiting for Jake. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why had this happened? What had the security guard been trying to do? And why had he been so fixated on him? Ethan's gaze shifted to the passing cars, watching them as if they held the answers to his questions. He thought about how easily his life had been upended. A few hours ago, he had been a normal guy, running errands at the mall, and now he was questioning everything. Was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? He had never been in trouble with the law before. Now, his reputation felt tarnished. His fingers drummed nervously on the bench as he waited. Finally, Jake appeared, his face full of concern. He sat down beside Ethan without saying a word, and for a few moments, the two of them just sat in silence. Then Jake spoke softly, "Tell me everything." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The events of the past few hours were a blur, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let this go. He had been wrongly accused, and now, it felt like there was a target on his back. Jake listened intently as Ethan explained everything. The strange encounter with the security guard, the footage that seemed to implicate him, and the awkward confrontation with the officers. Jake's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said, his voice firm. "Someone's got it out for you." Ethan's heart sank at the thought. "But why me? I didn't do anything wrong." Jake sat back, crossing his arms. "I don't know, man. But we'll figure it out. We'll get to the bottom of this." Ethan looked at his friend, feeling a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For the first time in hours, he felt like there might be hope. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Ethan spent the next few days researching everything he could about the mall's security practices and the store where the incident occurred. He felt a gnawing sense of injustice, and the more he dug, the more he uncovered. There were murmurs about the mall's lax security protocols and rumors that certain security guards had been involved in similar incidents in the past. But the most troubling part was that no one had ever spoken up. The mall's official channels were tightly controlled, and any complaints seemed to vanish into thin air. He had to find a way to expose the truth, but how could he prove what happened when the evidence was so thin? After hours of scrolling through websites and forums, Ethan finally found a name: Angela Patterson. She was a former employee who had worked in the same store where the incident had taken place. Her testimony could be the key, but she had left the city a few years ago. Determined, Ethan decided to track her down, hoping she would be willing to talk. Ethan's search eventually led him to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Angela Patterson's name matched the address he found online. His heart raced as he approached the building, the weight of what he was about to do settling in. He wasn't sure she would even remember him or be willing to speak to him, but he had no other choice. As he reached her door, he hesitated for a moment, nerves threatening to overwhelm him. He knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened. Angela stood before him, a bit older than he remembered, but her eyes still held the same sharpness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. Ethan introduced himself and explained the situation, detailing his encounter at the mall. At first, Angela was reluctant, but after a few minutes of gentle persuasion, her eyes softened. "I knew something wasn't right," she said quietly, stepping back to let him inside. Inside her apartment, Angela listened quietly as Ethan recounted his story. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table, and she occasionally glanced at the floor, lost in thought. When Ethan finished speaking, there was a long silence before she spoke. "I knew something was off with that security guard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was always too focused on certain customers. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything. Then one day he was gone, and I never saw him again, but there were rumors." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as Angela paused, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "What rumors?" he asked, leaning forward. Angela took a deep breath. "That the mall was covering up incidents like yours, that the guard had done this before, but no one would speak up." The words hit Ethan like a brick. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Angela sighed. "I was scared. I didn't have proof, and no one believed me. I left town to get away from it all." Ethan could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Angela's story was a critical piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough on its own. He needed more. "Is there anyone else who might have seen something?" he asked urgently. Angela shook her head. "Not that I know of. The mall's security was tight-lipped about everything. They covered their tracks well." Ethan's frustration mounted. The system seemed rigged to protect itself. "What about the footage? Is there any chance you could get a copy of it?" he asked. Angela looked pained. "I've tried before. The mall controls everything. They won't let anything slip through the cracks." Ethan stared at her, his mind working furiously. There had to be a way in. He wasn't about to give up now. "You've helped me more than you know," he said, his voice determined. Angela nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. "Just be careful," she warned softly. "This place has a way of swallowing people whole." Ethan left Angela's apartment with more questions than answers, but he knew he was getting closer to the truth. With her help, he now had a lead, but time was running out. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had underestimated the system he was up against. The mall was a powerful entity, and whoever was behind the cover-ups had more resources than he did. But there was something else nagging at him: the security guard. If he could find out more about him, Ethan might have the leverage he needed. He returned to the mall the next day, determined to get to the bottom of everything. But the closer he got, the more the walls seemed to close in around him. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. As he stood in the shadow of the mall's towering exterior, Ethan made a vow to himself. He wasn't leaving until he had the truth. Ethan walked back into the mall with a new sense of determination. The events of the past few days had hardened him. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He had a plan. Armed with Angela's testimony and a growing sense of urgency, he was ready to confront the truth head-on. His first stop was the security office. The building seemed to pulse with energy, the bright lights casting long shadows in the hallways. As he approached the entrance to the security office, his nerves began to flare up again. But he couldn't let fear control him anymore. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the system, and that was far bigger than any fear he might feel. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the same stern faces greeted him, but this time he was prepared. He was going to demand answers. As Ethan entered the security office, the officers at the desk looked up, surprised to see him back. One of them, the same officer who had escorted him out earlier, scowled. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone stern. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm here to find out what happened to me. I was accused of something I didn't do." The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stood up slowly, as though he were preparing for an argument. "You were cleared," the officer said. "You should leave it alone." But Ethan wasn't backing down. "I'm not leaving until I understand why I was brought in the first place," he replied, his voice firm. The tension between them was palpable. The officer stared at him for a long moment, clearly annoyed, but then his expression shifted. He looked over at his partner and nodded. "Fine," he said, "but this is the last time." The officer, who had been sitting behind the desk, reluctantly swiped through the footage, his fingers hovering over the screen. Ethan watched closely, his pulse quickening. The moment the video began to play, he recognized the blur of motion, the footage of him that had been used against him. But this time there was something different. The image was clearer. It was obvious now that the footage had been tampered with. The guard who had been following him wasn't just a bystander, he was involved. "Look at this," Ethan said, pointing to the screen. "This isn't right. This footage has been altered." The officer glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. "We've reviewed this," the officer replied. "There's nothing to see here." But Ethan wasn't buying it. "You're lying," he said, his voice rising with the pressure of the moment. The officer's eyes flicked to the other man in the room, a subtle shift of discomfort passing between them. The air was thick with tension. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the officers. He could see the hesitation in their eyes, the moment of doubt creeping into their expressions. For the first time, they seemed unsure of themselves. Ethan seized the opportunity. "I know what's going on here," he said, his voice quieter but more forceful. "This is bigger than me, isn't it? The mall is covering something up, and you're part of it." The room fell silent. The officer standing beside him opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Ethan pressed on, sensing the shift. "You're not the only ones involved. Someone is behind all of this, and they're using you to keep it quiet." Finally, the officer spoke, his voice low. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he warned. "You're in over your head." Ethan left the security office with his head spinning. "No." The officers hadn't given him any answers, but they had shown their cards. They were hiding something, and that was the break he needed. He had to find a way to expose the truth. As he walked out of the building, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Jake. "I've got something. Meet me at the diner. I think I found a way in." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the lead he had been waiting for. He made his way to the diner, his mind racing with possibilities. Once he met up with Jake, everything would change. The plan was coming together, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The diner was nearly empty when Ethan arrived, the hum of the neon lights above creating a lonely atmosphere. Jake was already sitting in a booth by the window, a pile of papers scattered in front of him. As Ethan slid into the booth across from him, Jake didn't waste any time. "I think I've got something that'll help us," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. Ethan leaned in, his pulse quickening. Jake handed him a folder filled with printed emails and documents. "These are from a whistleblower who used to work in the mall's maintenance department," Jake continued. "They've got details about the security guard, his involvement in other incidents, and even the names of a few people who might be able to confirm everything." Ethan quickly flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the text. His heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. They had the evidence they needed. "This is it," Ethan muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "We can't stop now." Ethan's fingers trembled as he sifted through the documents, his mind racing with the possibilities. "This is bigger than I thought," he said quietly, more to himself than to Jake. "They've been covering up multiple incidents. This is a pattern, not just a mistake." Jake nodded, his face grim. "It looks like the mall's been burying these things for years. They've got money, power, and connections. They'll do anything to protect themselves." Ethan's thoughts began to spiral. He had known the mall was corrupt, but the extent of the cover-up was staggering. How many other people had been falsely accused? How many lives had been ruined? And why had they targeted him? He leaned back in the booth, his mind reeling. "We need to get this out in the open," Ethan said, his voice filled with resolve. "We can't let them get away with this." As the conversation continued, the diner's door swung open and a figure stepped inside. Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. A man in a suit, his face stern, walked over to their booth. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a calculating look in his eyes. "Ethan, I assume," the man said, his voice cold and authoritative. Ethan stiffened, unsure of how to react. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low, but protective. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes locked onto Ethan. "I represent the mall," he said, his tone unyielding. "I think you two need to stop digging." Ethan's gut twisted. This was it, the confrontation he had been preparing for. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline in his chest. The man's eyes never left Ethan as he spoke. "You think you can just walk into our operation and start causing trouble? You're out of your depth." Ethan's pulse quickened. "You're covering something up," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about me. There are others, aren't there?" The man smiled coldly. "You think you know everything. You're naive." He leaned in, his tone dropping to a whisper. "The mall has its ways, Ethan, and we always take care of problems like you, so I suggest you walk away before things get worse." Jake stood up suddenly, his fists clenched. "You think we're scared of you? We've got the truth now." The man's smile faded, and for a moment, Ethan could see the true threat behind his eyes. "This isn't a fight you want to pick, kid," the man said quietly. "You've been warned." With that, he stood up, tossed a business card onto the table, and walked out without another word. As the suited man left, Ethan and Jake exchanged a look. The weight of the conversation hung heavily in the air, but Ethan wasn't about to back down now. He picked up the business card and studied it. The name on it was of a lawyer who had close ties to the mall, someone with power and influence. "We need to act fast," Ethan said, his voice filled with urgency. "They won't stop at anything to protect their secrets." Jake nodded in agreement. "We've come this far, we're not turning back now." Ethan slipped the card into his pocket, his resolve hardening. "It's time to go public," he said. "We're taking this to the press." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure you're ready for that? They'll come after you harder." Ethan looked out the diner window, the streetlights flickering in the distance. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan sat in the front row, his eyes locked on the judge's bench as he waited for the hearing to begin. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. After weeks of gathering evidence, countless sleepless nights, and the threats that had loomed over him, they were finally taking their case to court. The mall's lawyers were ready for a fight, and so were they. Jake sat next to him, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a sense of urgency. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the bailiff called for order. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood with the rest of the room. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, entered and took her seat. The gavel slammed, and the trial began. Ethan's eyes scanned the room. His mind was focused on one thing: he wasn't going to let the system bury the truth again. The lawyer for the mall, a sharp-dressed man with a silver tie, stood up to make his opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you will see today is not a case of wrongful accusation, but a matter of public safety, he began, his voice smooth and confident. The defendant, Ethan, is simply looking for a way to make money off an unfortunate incident. The evidence is clear. Ethan's blood ran cold as he heard the words. They were framing him, twisting the narrative into something it wasn't. The lawyer continued, outlining their defense with polished words, painting a picture of Ethan as a disgruntled customer. Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting the anger rising in his chest. But then, his lawyer stood, interrupting. "We have evidence that proves otherwise," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "And we intend to show you the truth." Ethan's lawyer stood tall, confident as she approached the jury. She presented the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, emails, testimony, and most importantly, the tampered footage that exposed the mall's security system. She paused and looked each juror in the eye, making sure they understood the gravity of what was at stake. "This isn't just about Ethan," she said. "This is about holding powerful institutions accountable, about ensuring that no one else is wrongfully accused and trapped by a system that refuses to listen." The jury leaned in, their attention fully on her. Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, the truth was coming to light. His lawyer clicked through the evidence, the pieces falling into place, piece by piece. As she finished her presentation, Ethan knew they had a real chance. The next steps would decide everything. The hours dragged on, and Ethan could feel the weight of the trial bearing down on him. The cross-examinations were brutal. The opposing lawyer questioned every detail, trying to tear apart the evidence piece by piece. But Ethan remained steady, keeping his focus on the bigger picture. He couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. As the day wore on, the tension in the room reached its peak. Finally, it was time for the closing statements. Ethan's lawyer stood once more, her voice clear and firm as she addressed the jury. "This case isn't just about the mall, or the security guard. It's about a person's right to be treated fairly. Ethan didn't deserve to be accused, and he certainly didn't deserve to be silenced by a system that wanted to cover up its mistakes." The weight of her words settled over the room. The jury remained silent, but Ethan could feel their eyes on him. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in this whole ordeal, he believed in the possibility of justice. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Ethan sat with Jake in the quiet courtroom, both of them barely speaking. The weight of the past weeks, the stress, the fear, it was all leading up to this moment. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom went silent as the foreman stood to speak. "Woo, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Carter, not guilty of all charges." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the words hit him. Not guilty. It felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Like a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had suddenly been taken away. Jake squeezed his shoulder, a grin spreading across his face. The judge banged her gavel, and the room erupted in a mix of disbelief and relief. Ethan stood up, his legs shaky, as the reality of the verdict began to sink in. They had done it. The truth had won.